results. In other words, if the consumption goes down, people save, that's going to increase investment. And therefore, there isn't going to be any significant change in aggregate demand. That in fact, there is a market that coordinates and equilibrates planned savings with planned investment, and that is the loanable funds market. And there is a price that brings about this coordination of planned savings and planned investment, and that is the interest rate. So if you look at the classical view of the loanable funds market, and we're going to look at real variables, so we have loanable funds per unit time here. A demand for loanable funds in the form of real investment, a supply of loanable funds in the form of real savings. This is, I'm not using Mankiw's national savings, I'm looking at private savings, so it's private savings minus this savings, and real loanable funds. If there is this fall in consumption, right? It can only result from an increase in saving. The increase in saving causes a fall in the interest rate, and the fall in the interest rate dampens somewhat the fall in consumption and increases investment, and so there's no significant impact on aggregate demand. That was the classical view. Notice that this is another argument that implies that money is approximately neutral, that there is a classical dichotomy, that the velocity of money is fairly stable. Keynes embraced a third version of the underspending hypothesis. His shock was not overproduction, it was not under consumption, it was under investment. That's the initial shock. Well, normally, right, let's say you do have a Keynesian attack of animal spirits, right? And all of a sudden, people are less optimistic, investors are less optimistic about the future of the economy, and so investment falls. Well, that causes a fall in interest rates, which partially dampens the fall in investment and increases consumption. And therefore, no significant impact on aggregate demand. Keynes needed a really clever argument to get around Say's law, because what he wanted to do was he wanted to create an argument in which, rather than in the pre-Keynesian neoclassical view with prices and the market moderating shocks, moderating disequilibria, he wanted to come up with a theory in which the market actually magnified the shock, made it worse. So his argument proceeded in two steps. Right? He started with this shock to investment, but the first step was the Keynesian consumption function, which argued that the interest rate did not have much impact on people's consumption. Well, if the interest rate doesn't have much impact on people's consumption, right? Consumption is only a function of income. Interest rate doesn't matter. That means your savings curve is interest rate inelastic. Notice this, by the way, is what you have in your Solow model. Right? No impact of the interest rate on savings. Your saving rate is interest inelastic, right? Well, now look at what that accomplishes. Now you have your attack of animal spirits on investment, your shock to investment, and now your interest rate has to really fall, right? Because the fall in the interest rate is not going to induce any significant increase in consumption, so the interest rate has to fall enough to make investment remain constant. And that's where Keynes introduced the second part of his argument, all right? So the first part is the Keynesian consumption function, where, in its simplest form, savings is totally interest rate inelastic. But in a more sophisticated form, he might have made well, there's a slight upward slope to this curve, but not significant. Because as this interest rate falls, Keynes relied on what he called liquidity preference, right? If the interest rate falls, what's going to happen to the amount of money that people want to hang on to? Think of money as an asset that doesn't earn any interest. The interest rate is not the price of money, but the interest rate is one of the opportunity costs of holding money. And the higher the interest rate, the greater the opportunity cost of holding money. The lower the interest rate, the lower the opportunity cost of holding money. To take an extreme example, what are T-bills currently paying? Justin, do you know?
10 years, like 2.8.
T-bills?
Oh, T-bill. No.
Have they broached 1%, or are they still under 1%? Anyway, we're still in an economy. It's not quite as low as it was a couple of years ago, but interest rates are really low. Let's say that the interest rate on short-term Treasury borrowing, Treasury bills, all of a sudden jumped to 100% per day. So that if you buy a Treasury bill, you double your money. Notice how much cash you're going to want to hold under those circumstances. As little as you can get away with, right? You want to pull it out of all your savings accounts, all your cash, and put them into the Treasury securities. So a high interest rate means a high opportunity cost of holding money, a low demand for real cash balances. A low interest rate means that the opportunity cost of holding money has declined, and therefore the demand for money will go up. The demand for cash balances will go up, which is equivalent to saying that the velocity of money, right, is declining, which is equivalent to saying that autonomous expenditures are falling. So in other words, before the interest rate ever reached this equilibrating point, people start hoarding more money. So they're pulling money out of the circular flow, which means firms are in the position of Samsung, in my example before, right? People are buying fewer phones, and as a result, inventories go up. But they're not planned inventories, right? They're unplanned inventories. So these inventories are saving, so you still have an equivalence between actual saving and these inventories are investments, so you still have an equivalence between actual savings and actual investment, but planned savings far exceeds planned investment. And as these inventories go back, firms lay off workers, right? Firms lay off workers, and as firms lay off workers, what happens to output? Goes down, and if output goes down, what happens to income? They're the same thing. Income goes down. And if income goes down, what happens to consumption? it also goes down. So notice what Keynes has pulled off here, right? You have your initial shock, your fall in autonomous expenditures, the fall in investment, right? And rather than that being moderated by the market, it has induced, right, a further fall in consumption, so that the total fall in aggregate demand exceeds the size of the initial shock. And when does this stop? Well, if income is falling, not only is consumption falling, but savings is falling. So you only restore equilibrium when income has fallen enough to bring about an interest rate where savings equals investment. Now planned savings equals planned investment. But you have high unemployment. In other words, in Keynes's original vision, there was not a heavy emphasis on inflexible prices. All right? The emphasis was on the loan market. It was the Keynesian theory of the business cycle is a market failure theory of the business cycle, and in the Keynesian vision, it was the loanable funds market that was the market that was failing. It was not a good market at coordinating savings and investment. It was not a good market at coordinating people saving in the present and investing for the future. And this leads to one way of describing what's going on here that used to be prominent in the textbooks. It's referred to as the paradox of thrift. All right? Under your neoclassical view, your long-term view, if savings goes up, investment goes up, capital accumulation takes place, and income and output go up. But what Keynes was saying is that in these circumstances, because people are saving in the form of hoarding money, right, it's causing output and income to go down. And you can see this in the debates today, right? Here's your Keynesian economists, right, grabbing consumers by the throat, telling them in the midst of a recession, you need to spend more. And here's your neoclassical economist saying, no, that's not right. If you want to increase output and income, you need to save more. Now, if you understand how this process works on the downside, you can understand your Keynesian multiplier. Because basically, Keynes's view is that you need the government to come in here and stimulate aggregate demand, because it will take too long for the economy to equilibrate, if it ever equilibrates. Remember, in his initial view, you have a high unemployment equilibrium. So, what do? We have the government. I'll now bring in the government. Increase spending, right? But the government has to increase spending without dampening private consumption or private investment. If the government increases spending by taxing, right, that's going to reduce people's incomes, their disposable income. That's going to tend to reduce consumption. So the best way to stimulate aggregate demand is for the government to increase its spending and financing it entirely through a deficit. Because what is the deficit doing? The deficit is the government, right, going into this loanable funds market, right? Because the government's indifferent. That's the government deficit. Expenditures minus taxes in real terms. The government is indifferent about what the interest rate is. In fact, it likes the low interest rate. So the government goes in, borrows money, right? By which mechanism it starts to raise the interest rate. But more important, the borrowed money is re-injected into the circular flow. There is no impact on consumption and investment. In fact, this government deficit is essentially sucking money out of people's cash hoards, re-injecting it into the economy. And as a result, aggregate demand starts to go back up, output goes back up, unemployment goes down, and therefore income goes back up, and the increase in income causes a further increase in consumption, and there's the Keynesian multiplier.
Wouldn't that only work if the money the government was borrowing and people wouldn't invest it anyways? So like someone's one thing.
And that is the big, you've hit the big debate about whether fiscal policy works or not. All right? Is it money that's being pulled out of cash hoards, or is it money that is crowding out private spending? But this is the Keynesian view. So, and in fact, the Keynesians used to use the term pump priming to refer to fiscal policy, because you only did I mention that term earlier in this class? Yeah, okay, so I went. Because a little bit of this will give you a lot of this with respect to the multiplier. Actually, there are 3 Keynesian multipliers. Mankiw only tells you about 2 of them. But there are actually 3 Keynesian multipliers, because the third one is kind of an embarrassment. All right? The strongest multiplier is when the deficit is increased by the government increasing its expenditures. This is known as the government purchases multiplier. And it's increasing not its expenditures by giving money to people, but by actually purchasing goods and services. This gives you the strongest multiplier. You also have a tax multiplier, where the government increases the deficit by reducing taxes. And that's not as strong, because by reducing taxes, you're increasing people's disposable income directly, and they're going to hang on to some of that increase. They're not going to spend it all. Whereas if the government is just increasing its spending all of it. So the tax multiplier is not quite as strong as the government purchases multiplier. Right? One, in other words, how do you increase the deficit? Either by driving that up or driving that down. Right? So that's the government purchases multiplier. That's the tax multiplier. Government purchases multiplier is stronger than the tax multiplier. Well, logically, right? If the government increases expenditures with a balanced budget, which means it's increasing spending, which by itself would have a positive multiplier, and it's increasing taxes, which would have a negative multiplier, but not as strong as the positive multiplier from increasing government purchases, you actually should have a balanced budget multiplier, which is really small. And what should government do if aggregate demand is too high? If inflation, it should make deficits smaller, it should tax more, it should spend less. And as I mentioned, the last time this was tried was under Lyndon Johnson. And that's where the term counter-cyclical fiscal policy comes in. Now, in the real world, if you're calculating your multiplier, you get your strongest multiplier with the Keynesian cross model, where the interest rate is held constant, or the amount of investment is held constant. You get your next, if you move from your Keynesian cross to ISLN, where you allow the interest rate to actually vary, you get a slightly weaker multiplier. And then once you introduce price level flexibility, you get a multiplier that depends on the slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So initially, when these models were put into the textbooks, you got really large multipliers, but I want to show you now the multipliers that Mancube has in the chapter we read for last week. One of the chapters we read for last week. All right, this is the government purchases multiplier, and this is the tax multiplier. Notice that if the money supply is held constant, the current estimate of the multiplier effect is 0.6. In other words, if the government increases its expenditures by $100 million, you're only going to get a $60 million increase in aggregate demand. And the tax multiplier, it's a negative because it's looking at an increase in taxes, but it's only 0.26. And that's if the money supply is held constant. Notice what happens when you have the money supply supporting fiscal policy by increasing the money supply to keep interest rates constant. The multipliers actually go up, which of course, remember the Friedman interview? When he talks about fiscal policy versus monetary policy, and he makes the argument that there are very few instances where they're working in the opposite direction. They're always working in the same direction, and so his argument is actually monetary policy that's doing the work. Now, these are just estimates of the multiplier. All right, so any questions so far? As you read last week, once you go from ISLM to aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and then you have some price flexibility, that's what's causing these multipliers to be attenuated in terms of their impact. And now you have the issue of, well, the economy is going to adjust in the long run, so why do we need to intervene? Now, your traditional Keynesians, in the early days of the Keynesian revolution, they resisted the notion that you were actually going to have a long-run adjustment. Right? Remember, we have the unemployment equilibrium with the inverted L-shaped aggregate supply curve. In other words, they resisted the notion that the Keynesian business cycle theory actually required price or wage rigidity. In fact, Keynes himself made a series of arguments. This is a description of the Keynesian view from Roger Garrison, fairly accurate. There are no market mechanisms, at least none identified by Keynes, that can effectively allocate resources intertemporally, that's over time. The rate of interest is determined by the supply and demand for money. The decision to invest is based in large part on the groundless expectations held by the business community or on animal spirits, to use Keynes' own terminology. Not surprisingly, booms and busts occur with waxing and waning of business confidence. When confidence is on the wane, the demand for labor falls, resulting in widespread unemployment. And here's the critical part. In Keynes' view, wage rates either one, will not fall because of unions or because of wage rigidities